Look around you. The room you're sitting in, the screen you're watching, the sound of my voice arriving in your ears right now, this instant. It all feels unquestionably real, solid, present, undeniable. You don't question the chair beneath you. You don't question the light from the screen. You certainly don't question the fact that you are a single, continuous person reading these words in a world that exists exactly as it appears. But throughout history, some of the greatest minds our species has produced, philosophers, mathematicians, physicists, monks, mystics, have argued that this certainty is an illusion, not a comforting illusion, not a harmless one. A total structural illusion built into the very architecture of how we experience anything at all. They didn't all agree on why. Some blamed the senses. Some blamed the mind. Some blamed the universe itself. But they converged again and again on the same unsettling suspicion that what you call reality might be several layers removed from whatever reality actually is. Tonight we're going to walk through 7 of those arguments. Not as a list of curiosities, but as a genuine escalation, each one chipping away at a different foundation, from the shadows on a cave wall to the strange behavior of particles that seem to change when you look at them. By the end, you may still believe reality is real. Most people do, and there are good reasons to, but you probably won't believe it for the same reasons you do right now. And that shift, small, quiet, permanent, is really the only honest goal of a night like this. It's worth being honest before we start about why this particular question keeps returning generation after generation instead of simply getting settled once and answered for good. Most philosophical debates evolve. Ethics has moved through countless frameworks. Political philosophy has been rewritten by revolutions, by new economic systems, by centuries of hard-won moral progress. But the question of what reality fundamentally is, and whether we can ever know it directly, has never been closed off in the way a scientific question eventually gets closed off. Nobody seriously debates anymore whether the sun orbits the Earth. But serious, credentialed people, physicists at the top of their field, philosophers with endowed chairs, neuroscientists running cutting-edge laboratories continue, right now in the present tense, to disagree about what is actually happening beneath the surface of ordinary experience. That persistence alone should tell you something. This isn't a question waiting for someone clever enough to finally solve it. It may be a question built into the very structure of what it means to be a limited, embedded mind trying to evaluate the totality it's embedded within. So let's begin where the whole tradition begins. Not with a scientist, not with an experiment, with a story about a cave. 24 centuries ago, in Athens, a philosopher named Plato sat down to write one of the strangest and most enduring thought experiments in the history of human thought. It appears in his book The Republic, tucked inside a larger conversation about justice and the ideal state, and it has outlived the empire that produced it, outlived the language it was written in, outlived every political system it was meant to critique. Picture a cave. Deep underground, sealed from daylight. Inside, a group of prisoners have lived their entire lives chained in place, facing a blank wall. They cannot turn their heads. They cannot look at each other. They cannot see the cave mouth behind them or the world beyond it. All they can see, for their whole lives, is the wall in front of them. Behind the prisoners burns a fire. And between the fire and the prisoners, unseen figures walk back and forth, carrying statues and carved objects, animals, tools, human figures raised above a low wall so their shadows fall onto the stone in front of the captives. The prisoners watch these shadows flicker and move. They hear echoes bouncing off the cave walls, and because they've never experienced anything else, they assume the voices belong to the shadows themselves. For the prisoners, the shadows are not a representation of reality. The shadows are reality. It's the only reality they've ever known. If a shadow shaped like a horse crosses the wall, they say a horse. If 2 shadows appear to speak, they attribute the voice to the shadow, not to the puppeteer or the fire. Their entire conceptual world, every judgment, every argument, every claim about what's true is built entirely on second-hand projections of things they will never directly see. Now imagine one prisoner is freed, unchained, forced to stand, forced to turn around. At first this is not liberation, it's agony. The fire, which the prisoner has never looked at directly, burns his eyes. The carved objects, so much stranger and more detailed than their flat shadow versions, are disorienting, almost incomprehensible. Plato is explicit about this. The initial encounter with a slightly larger truth is not pleasant. It's closer to pain. Now drag that same prisoner further out of the cave entirely, up a steep and rugged path into open daylight. The sun is blinding. The prisoner can't look at anything directly at first. He has to adjust slowly, first shadows and reflections in water, then the objects themselves, then finally, after a long period of adjustment, the sun, the source of everything, the thing that makes sight possible in the first place. Once his eyes adjust, the prisoner understands something the others in the cave cannot even conceive of. He sees that the fire was only ever a crude imitation of the sun. He sees that the carved statues were only ever crude imitations of real objects. He sees the whole hierarchy of illusion he spent his life mistaking for the whole of existence. And here is where Plato's story turns genuinely dark. The freed prisoner, having seen the truth, feels compelled to go back down into the cave to tell the others. But his eyes, now adjusted to sunlight, are suddenly useless in the dark. He stumbles. He fumbles. To the prisoners who never left, he looks worse off than before, clumsy, confused, talking about some blinding light that doesn't exist. And if he tries to free them, tries to drag them up that same painful path he walked, Plato suggests they might kill him rather than follow him. It's worth sitting with that ending, because it's easy to treat the cave as a tidy metaphor about ignorance and enlightenment and skip past the actual violence in it. Plato is telling us that truth is not simply comforting once discovered. That the people most committed to their shadows may punish, not thank, anyone who tries to show them the fire. What makes the allegory of the cave endure isn't really the imagery, striking as it is. It's the structural claim underneath it that most of what we call knowledge is knowledge of representations, not knowledge of the things themselves. Plato thought the physical world we inhabit, chairs, trees, bodies, cities, is itself a kind of shadow, a flickering, imperfect copy of a deeper realm of perfect and changing forms. The chair you're sitting on is an approximation of chairness. The love you feel is an approximation of love itself. Every object you touch is a shadow cast by something more real than the object. It's worth dwelling for a moment on why Plato chose a cave specifically, rather than some other setting, because the choice isn't incidental. A cave is enclosed. It has a single, narrow opening to the outside, and everything the prisoners know has been mediated through firelight and stone before it ever reaches them. There's something almost womb-like about the image, a birth canal in reverse, where enlightenment requires painful, difficult passage up and out, rather than the comfortable passivity of simply being carried along. Plato was a student of Socrates, and Socrates had been executed by the city of Athens officially for corrupting the youth and failing to honor the city's gods, but really, many historians believe, for relentlessly exposing the ignorance of powerful people who preferred their comfortable certainties. It's difficult not to read the cave's violent ending, the freed prisoner returning, only to be threatened, perhaps killed, by those who never left, as Plato processing his own teacher's death. The story isn't just an abstract epistemological puzzle. It's also, quietly, an elegy. You don't have to accept Plato's theory of the forms to feel the force of the underlying question. How would you know if you were a prisoner? Not the dramatic, science fiction version of the question, but the quiet, everyday version. How much of what you believe is true have you actually verified yourself, first-hand versus absorbed as reflections of reflections, second-hand reports, inherited assumptions, things repeated so often they feel self-evident? Plato thought our senses deceive us, that the physical world itself is a diminished copy of something realer standing behind it. That roughly 2,000 years later, a French philosopher sitting alone by a fire in a rented room in Germany would push the doubt even further. He wouldn't just ask whether our senses show us shadows instead of true forms. He'd ask something more radical. What if we can't even trust that we're perceiving anything real at all? What if, right now, we're simply asleep, dreaming all of it? In the winter of 1619, a young soldier named René Descartes found himself snowed into a small room somewhere in Germany with nothing to do but think. He would later describe this period as the beginning of a total philosophical reconstruction, an attempt to tear down every belief he held and rebuild knowledge from a foundation so certain that no argument could ever shake it again. He published the results of that project years later in 1641 in a short, strange, deeply personal book called Meditations on First Philosophy. And the method he used to demolish his own beliefs is what we now call Cartesian doubt, the deliberate, systematic practice of doubting everything that can possibly be doubted just to see what, if anything, survives. He starts modestly. He notices that his senses have deceived him before. A stick half submerged in water looks bent, though it's straight. Distant towers that look round turn out, up close, to be square. If his senses have been wrong before, he reasons, they can't be fully trusted as a foundation for certain knowledge. That's a relatively easy claim to accept. We've all misjudged something we saw or heard. But Descartes pushes further into much stranger territory. Even if the senses occasionally lie about specific details, surely, he says, there are some things so basic that doubting them seems insane. I am sitting here by this fire, in this dressing gown, holding this paper in my hands. Surely that much is beyond doubt. And then he delivers the blow that makes this argument famous. How do I know, he asks, that I am not asleep right now, dreaming all of this? Think about your own dreams for a moment. Not the strange, obviously symbolic dreams, the ones with flying or talking animals or impossible physics. Think about the ordinary ones. The dreams where you're simply at work or in your childhood bedroom or having a completely mundane conversation with a friend. While you're inside that dream, it doesn't feel like a dream. It feels exactly, precisely, indistinguishably like waking life. You don't experience a little disclaimer floating in the corner of your vision reminding you that none of this is real. The dream simply is your reality, for as long as it lasts. Descartes points out that there is no reliable internal marker, no feeling, no texture, no sensation that definitively separates waking experience from dreaming experience while you're having it. Some people claim they can tell the difference because dreams feel fuzzier or less vivid. But this is a claim made from the outside in retrospect after waking up and comparing memories. In the moment, dreams can feel every bit as sharp, as detailed, as embodied as anything you're experiencing right now. It's worth noticing, too, how carefully Descartes builds his doubt in stages, because the structure of the argument is part of what makes it so difficult to escape. He doesn't simply assert that nothing can be trusted. He walks through it methodically, closing off each possible refuge one at a time. Perhaps you might object, the senses are unreliable about distant or unusual things, a bent stick in water, a square tower that looks round from far away, but surely they're reliable about what's immediately, intimately present, your own body, your own hands, the paper in front of you. Descartes anticipates this objection and dismantles it directly. He points out that people suffering from certain conditions have been known to insist with total sincerity that their limbs are made of glass, or that they are already dead, delusions so severe that the sufferer's own body no longer feels like reliable evidence of anything. If the mind can be wrong about something as basic as the material composition of its own limbs, on what grounds can you be certain your mind isn't wrong about something else equally basic right now? There's an even stranger wrinkle to this, one that Descartes didn't have the modern vocabulary for, but that makes his argument land even harder today: the false awakening. Many people report dreaming that they wake up getting out of bed, walking to the bathroom, starting their morning routine, only to actually wake up minutes later and realize the entire waking up sequence was itself part of the dream. Some report this happening in layers, waking from a dream, going about their day, and then waking again, and realizing the entire day was nested inside another dream. If the mind can convincingly simulate not just experience but the specific experience of waking up from a dream, what confidence can you have that your current sense of being awake isn't just another layer of the same simulation? So Descartes arrives at a genuinely radical position for a 17th century philosopher. He cannot, from the inside, using reason alone, prove that he is not dreaming right now. The fire he sees, the paper in his hands, his own body, none of it can be certified as waking reality rather than an extremely convincing dream. Most people, faced with this thought experiment, want to escape it quickly because it's uncomfortable to sit with. But Descartes refuses to escape it. Instead, he escalates it. What if the dream argument doesn't go far enough? What if there is something even worse than dreaming, an active, intelligent force deliberately deceiving you about everything? He calls this hypothetical force the evil demon or evil genius, a being of immense power and cunning whose entire purpose is to construct a totally convincing false reality around you. Under this hypothesis, it's not just that you might be dreaming. It's that an external intelligence might be feeding you a complete simulated world, complete with a body that feels pain, a sky that looks blue, memories of a childhood that never happened, all of it engineered deliberately to deceive you about the true nature of things. This is worth pausing on because it's essentially the philosophical ancestor of every what if none of this is real story that has come after it, every simulation film, every artificial intelligence twist, every reality-bending science fiction plot you've ever seen. Descartes got there first, using nothing but a chair, a fire, and 4 centuries before computers existed. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Descartes never actually refutes the evil demon hypothesis. He doesn't produce some clever piece of evidence that rules it out. What he does instead is something more modest and arguably more honest. He finds one single thing that survives even the evil demon's deception. If there is a demon deceiving me about everything, my body, the fire, the paper, the room, there is still one fact the demon cannot fake, the fact that something is being deceived. Doubt itself requires a doubter. Thought requires a thinker. Even if every single thing Descartes perceives is false, the very act of perceiving it falsely proves that some thinking thing exists to be deceived. This is the origin of his famous line, I think, therefore I am the cogito, the one indestructible foundation he manages to build in the wreckage of total doubt. Notice, though, what the cogito actually proves and what it doesn't. It proves that a thinking thing exists. It does not prove that the fire is real. It does not prove that your body is real. It does not prove that the world outside your own mind exists in anything like the form you perceive it. Descartes spends the rest of the meditations trying to rebuild a bridge back out to the external world, invoking the existence of a non-deceiving God as a kind of guarantee that our clear and distinct perceptions are generally trustworthy. Most philosophers since have found that part of his argument much weaker than the doubt that came before it. The doubt is airtight. The escape from the doubt is far more fragile. So what Descartes leaves us with, stripped of the 17th century theology, is this: your senses cannot prove they are trustworthy, using only your senses. Any attempt to verify your perceptions using your perceptions is circular. You are, in a very real sense, sealed inside your own experience, with no external checkpoint to confirm that the experience corresponds to anything beyond itself. Descartes imagined a supernatural deceiver because that was the vocabulary available to a 17th century mind steeped in scholastic theology. But 350 years later, philosophers working in a world of neuroscience and computer science would ask the same question in a radically updated form. They wouldn't need a demon anymore. They'd have something that felt, to a modern audience, uncomfortably plausible: a laboratory, a set of electrodes, and a jar. In 1981, the philosopher Hilary Putnam offered a version of Descartes' nightmare updated for the age of neuroscience. Imagine, he said, that a mad scientist removes your brain from your body, keeps it alive in a vat of nutrient fluid, and connects its neurons to a supercomputer. That computer feeds your brain electrical signals precisely calibrated to simulate an entire life: sights, sounds, smells, the feeling of walking, the ache of a stubbed toe, the taste of coffee, the sound of a voice you love. From the inside, this simulated life would be completely indistinguishable from an ordinary one. You would have no way of noticing the vat, the wires, or the scientist, because your entire experience of your own body and your own senses is itself being manufactured by the same signals. This is, in essence, Descartes' evil demon translated into the language of neuroscience. But it's worth taking a moment to feel how much more plausible it seems to a modern audience than a supernatural demon ever could. We now know, empirically, that consciousness and sensation are produced by electrical and chemical activity in the brain. We know that surgeons can stimulate specific neurons and cause a patient to smell burnt toast, or feel a phantom touch on a hand that isn't there, or suddenly recall a childhood memory with total vividness. If a scalpel and an electrode can already produce fragments of manufactured experience, the leap to a fully engineered artificial life doesn't require any supernatural machinery at all. It only requires more wires and more computing power than we currently have. It's worth grounding this in something more concrete than pure hypothesis, because the VAT scenario can otherwise feel like a moored science fiction rather than a serious extension of what neuroscience has already demonstrated. Consider split-brain patients, people who, typically as a treatment for severe epilepsy, have had the corpus callosum, the thick band of nerve fibers connecting the brain's two hemispheres, surgically severed. In carefully controlled experiments, researchers can present an image exclusively to one hemisphere, say, flashing a picture of a spoon only to the left half of the visual field, which is processed by the right hemisphere, and the patient will report, quite genuinely, that they saw nothing at all, because the verbal, language-producing left hemisphere never received that information. Yet if asked to reach behind a screen and pick out the object they saw using their left hand controlled by the same right hemisphere that received the image, they will correctly select the spoon, all while their language centers insist they have no idea why they made that particular choice. Experiments like this reveal, with unsettling clarity, just how much of what feels like a single, unified, continuous conscious experience is actually being assembled moment to moment from separate streams of processing that don't always agree with each other. If a scalpel severing a few centimeters of nerve tissue can fracture the unified sense of self this dramatically, the idea that a sufficiently sophisticated set of external signals could construct an entire convincing self from scratch starts to feel less like fantasy and more like a natural extrapolation of what neuroscience already tells us the brain is capable of doing. Consider what this would actually feel like from the inside, because that's the part people tend to skip past. If your brain have been in a vat since birth, receiving nothing but engineered signals, then everything you have ever called your life would still feel completely coherent. You would remember a childhood, even if that childhood was never physically lived. You would feel emotions, love, grief, boredom, hope, because those emotions are themselves neural events, and neural events can be triggered artificially just as easily as they can be triggered by an actual falling leaf or an actual embrace. Nothing about the VAT hypothesis requires your inner life to feel fake. That's exactly what makes it so difficult to dismiss. It is specifically designed to be experientially seamless. This is where Putnam introduces one of the more elegant twists in the entire history of skeptical philosophy. He wasn't simply restating the brain in a vat scenario to frighten his readers. He was trying to argue, in a fairly technical way, that the sentence "I am a brain in a vat" might actually defeat itself the moment you try to say it meaningfully. His reasoning runs roughly like this. Words get their meaning from some kind of causal connection to the things they refer to. When you use the word tree, that word means what it means because of a long causal history connecting your use of the word to actual trees. You learned it by pointing at trees, hearing others use it around trees, and so on. Now imagine you really are a brain in a vat and you have been since birth and you've never had any causal contact with real trees, only with the electrical signals a computer generates to simulate the experience of trees. In that case, Putnam argues, when your brain thinks the word tree, it isn't actually referring to real trees at all. At best, it's referring to the electronic impulses or to whatever image the simulation is generating. So if you, as an invatted brain, try to say the sentence, "I am a brain in a vat," the word brain in your mouth wouldn't refer to a real, biological brain because you've never had causal contact with one, and the word vat wouldn't refer to a real vat either. The sentence would come out meaning something like, "I am an image of a brain in an image of a vat," which is almost certainly false, since you'd just be a normal simulated experience describing itself in simulated terms. In other words, if you really are a brain in a vat, you can't truthfully say so because the very words you'd use to say it wouldn't hook onto the real things those words are supposed to mean. And if you're not a brain in a vat, then obviously the sentence is false too. Either way, Putnam argues, the sentence can never be truly and meaningfully asserted, which is a strange, almost magician's trick way of trying to neutralize the entire hypothesis using language itself, rather than evidence. There's a further wrinkle worth considering, one that later philosophers raised in response to Putnam. Even granting his argument about causal reference, it only really applies to a brain that had been invatted since birth, with no prior causal history of interacting with a real external world. But what about a brain that lived a normal life for 30 years, forming real causal connections to real trees, real vats, real language, and was only then, last night, removed and connected to the machine? For that brain, the argument seems to lose its force. Its use of the word tree would still refer to real trees formed through decades of genuine causal contact, even if its current experience is entirely fabricated. This version of the thought experiment, sometimes called recent envatment, sidesteps Putnam's linguistic escape route entirely, and arguably represents the more psychologically unsettling version of the scenario anyway, since it doesn't require imagining a life you never actually had. It only requires imagining that the life you did have simply stopped being real at some specific, undetectable point. Not everyone finds this argument fully convincing. Many philosophers have pushed back on Putnam's assumptions about how reference and meaning actually work, but it's worth noting because it represents something different from Descartes' approach. Descartes tried to escape the demon by finding one certain fact, the cogito, and building outward from there. Putnam tried something almost the opposite, showing that the skeptical hypothesis, taken fully seriously, might collapse under its own linguistic weight before you even need to disprove it empirically. But regardless of whether Putnam's clever escape route works, the core problem remains uncomfortably intact. You cannot point to any experience, any memory, any sensation, and use it as proof that you are not invatted because a sufficiently sophisticated vat would produce exactly that experience, memory, or sensation as part of the simulation. Every piece of evidence you might offer is itself manufacturable by the very hypothesis you're trying to refute. This is what philosophers call an underdetermination problem. The available evidence is compatible with multiple, radically different explanations, and there's no experiment you could run from inside the system to settle which one is true. For most of the 20th century, the brain in a vat scenario remained a philosopher's thought experiment, vivid, unsettling, but essentially science fiction. Then computing changed everything, and a very similar argument reappeared, not from a philosopher of language, but from an Oxford philosopher thinking carefully about statistics, probability, and the long-term trajectory of civilizations with enough computing power to do something extraordinary. In 2003, Nick Bostrom published a paper with an almost deceptively simple title, "Are You Living in a Computer Simulation?" Unlike Descartes' demon or Putnam's fact, Bostrom wasn't primarily interested in radical, unfalsifiable doubt for its own sake. He was interested in probability. His argument doesn't ask you to imagine some exotic malicious deceiver. It asks you to think seriously about what a technologically mature civilization would likely do with enough computing power, and what the statistical consequences of that choice would be for anyone wondering whether their own reality is fundamental or simulated. Here is the structure of Bostrom's arguments stripped down to its bones. First, imagine that civilizations advanced enough to survive their own technological adolescence eventually develop computers powerful enough to simulate entire conscious minds, not crude approximations but full, detailed simulations of people who think, feel, and believe themselves to be genuinely alive, embedded in a genuinely physical world. This is sometimes called an ancestor simulation because such a civilization might run these simulations specifically to study its own history or the history of civilizations like it. Second, ask whether such a civilization, once capable of running these simulations, would likely run just one or many. Given how cheap it becomes to run additional simulations once the technology exists, much the way a modern computer can run thousands of instances of the same video game simultaneously, Bostrom argues it's plausible that an advanced civilization interested in ancestor simulations would run not one but millions or billions. Third, and this is the crucial statistical move, if there are billions of simulated conscious minds for every one real, biological, historically original mind, then any given conscious observer, including you, right now, wondering about this, is statistically far more likely to be one of the simulated minds than the one original. Not because simulation is inherently more likely philosophically, but simply because of the overwhelming numbers involved. If 99% of all conscious observers who ever exist are simulated, then picking a conscious observer at random and you have no special reason to think you're the exception means you're probably one of the 99%. Bostrom is careful, and it's worth being equally careful here, because his argument is frequently misunderstood and oversimplified into a much stronger claim than he actually makes. He does not argue that we definitely live in a simulation. He presents what's known as a trilemma, three possibilities, at least one of which he believes must be true. Either civilizations almost always go extinct before reaching the technological capability to run ancestor simulations, meaning nobody ever gets the chance. Or civilizations that do reach that capability overwhelmingly choose not to run such simulations, for ethical or practical reasons we might not yet anticipate. Or, and this is the unsettling third option, we are, in fact, almost certainly living inside a simulation, because if any significant number of advanced civilizations do choose to run these simulations, simulated minds would vastly outnumber original ones. There's a detail in Bostrom's original paper that rarely makes it into popular summaries, and it's worth including here because it sharpens the argument considerably. Bostrom points out that the computational resources required to simulate a mind in convincing detail don't necessarily require simulating the entire universe down to the last subatomic particle at all times. A sufficiently advanced simulation might only need to render fine detail wherever a simulated observer happens to be looking closely enough to notice rendering distant galaxies, for instance, at far lower fidelity than the immediate environment of a simulated conscious being, the way a video game only fully renders the portion of a map currently within a player's view. This is, of course, unfalsifiable from the inside in exactly the way you'd expect. If the simulation is competently designed, you'd never be able to catch it cutting corners, because the corners would only ever be cut exactly where and when you weren't looking closely enough to notice the seam. The popular imagination has mostly compressed this trilemma into a single dramatic claim: maybe we're living in a video game complete with pop culture references to glitches in the Matrix and suspicious feelings of déjà vu. But Bostrom's actual argument is more careful, more probabilistic, and frankly more interesting than the meme version. It isn't really a claim about video games. It's a claim about what follows logically once you accept two fairly modest premises: that consciousness can, in principle, be substrate independent, meaning it doesn't require biological neurons specifically, just the right kind of information processing, and that a sufficiently advanced civilization could eventually possess the computing power to simulate minds at scale. It's worth being explicit here about what this argument is not saying, because it's easy to slide into overstatement. This is not a claim that we definitely live in a simulation. It is not a proof. It's a probability argument built on several assumptions about the nature of consciousness, about the trajectory of technological civilizations, about what advanced beings would actually choose to do with their capabilities, any one of which could turn out to be false. Critics have pushed back on nearly every step. Some question whether consciousness really is substrate independent in the way the argument requires. Some question whether the computational cost of simulating a fully detailed universe down to the quantum level might be far higher than Bostrom assumes, perhaps so high that no civilization, however advanced, could run more than a handful of such simulations, undermining the statistical logic. Others question the entire premise that advanced civilizations would have any particular interest in simulating their own ancestral past in such detail. But even the critics of the argument tend to agree on the more modest, more important claim buried underneath the probability math: we currently have no way of empirically distinguishing a base-level, fundamentally real universe from a sufficiently sophisticated simulated one. If a simulation were detailed enough, rendering reality convincingly at whatever scale you happen to be observing it, there would be no experiment available to the simulated inhabitants that could conclusively prove they weren't simulated. The argument isn't really claiming that the universe is fake. It's claiming that we cannot rule out the possibility, and that the numbers, if certain assumptions hold, might even tilt the odds in an uncomfortable direction. It's worth noting how quickly this argument escaped academic philosophy and embedded itself in mainstream culture, because that trajectory is itself revealing. Within a decade of Bostrom's paper, prominent figures in technology and science were discussing the simulation hypothesis openly, sometimes assigning it startlingly high odds of being true, and the idea worked its way into popular films, television, and everyday conversation far more thoroughly than almost any other piece of contemporary academic philosophy. Part of that spread surely owes something to the Wachowskis' film The Matrix, released 4 years before Bostrom's paper, which had already primed a global audience with vivid imagery for exactly this kind of doubt, though it's worth remembering that the philosophical argument and the science fiction premise, however similar they look on the surface, are doing different work. The film imagines a deliberately hostile deception, machines harvesting human bodies while feeding their minds a false world. Bostrom's argument doesn't require hostility or harvesting or any malicious intent at all. It only requires curiosity and advanced civilization interested enough in its own history to model it computationally, the same impulse that drives historians, novelists, and video game designers today, just extended forward to a point where the models involved are detailed enough to contain minds that don't know they are inside one. I want to be precise about this because it matters. This is not saying we live in a simulation. It's saying we can't currently dismiss the possibility using any tool we presently have, not observation, not experiment, not intuition. And that, on its own, is a strange thing to accept about the only reality you will ever directly know. But maybe, at this point, we're asking the wrong question entirely. Plato asked whether the physical world is a shadow of something more real. Descartes asked whether the physical world might be a total fabrication. Putnam and Bostrom updated that fabrication with VATs and supercomputers. All four, in their own way, are asking, is the world out there deceiving us? But what if the deception, if there is one, isn't coming from outside at all? What if the limitation isn't the universe? What if it's us, the very apparatus we use to perceive anything in the first place? In 1781, a philosopher working in the small Prussian city of Königsberg, a man who, according to local legend, kept such a precise daily schedule that neighbors reportedly set their clocks by his afternoon walk, published a book that would fundamentally rearrange the relationship between mind and world. Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is not an easy book. It's dense, technical, and famously difficult even for professional philosophers. But buried inside its architecture is one of the most quietly radical claims in the history of thought, that we never experience reality as it actually is. We only ever experience reality as our minds are structured to process it. Kant draws a distinction between what he calls the noumenon and the phenomenon. The noumenon is the thing as it exists in itself, independent of any observer, independent of any mind perceiving it, reality exactly as it is, unfiltered. The phenomenon is the thing as it appears to us, already shaped, organized, and structured by the perceiving mind before we ever become conscious of it. And Kant's radical claim is that human beings have access only to the phenomenon. The noumenon, the thing in itself, is permanently, structurally beyond our reach. Not because we lack the right instruments or the right vantage point, the way a nearsighted person lacks the right glasses, but because the very act of perceiving anything requires organizing raw sensory input using mental structures that are not themselves found out there in the world. Here is the part of Kant's argument that tends to land hardest, because it applies to concepts most people assume are simply features of the external universe, not features of the mind observing it. Consider space and time. Most of us assume that space and time are properties of the universe itself, that objects exist out there in a three-dimensional space moving through a fourth dimension of time, entirely independent of whether any mind is around to notice. Kant argued the opposite. He claimed that space and time are not things we discover in the external world. They are the necessary preconditions the mind imposes in order to organize sensory data into any coherent experience at all. You cannot experience anything, a sound, a color, a touch, without automatically locating it somewhere and someone. But that somewhere and someone, Kant argues, is a structure your mind supplies, not a structure you're passively detecting. Alongside space and time, Kant identified a set of what he called categories of understanding, basic conceptual structures like causation, unity, plurality, necessity, that the mind automatically applies to raw experience in order to turn a chaotic stream of sensation into a coherent world of distinct objects doing distinct things to one another. When you watch one billiard ball strike another and see the second ball move, you don't just perceive two separate, disconnected events happening to occur one after another. You perceive causation: the first ball caused the second to move. But Kant argues that causation itself isn't something you can directly observe with your senses the way you observe color or shape. You never actually see causing happening. You see one event, then another event, and your mind supplies the causal connective tissue that binds them into a single meaningful sequence. The causation is doing real work, but the work is being done by the categories of your understanding, not by anything you've directly witnessed in the raw sensory data itself. It helps to think about this with a few concrete, almost mundane examples, because Kant's abstraction can otherwise feel untethered from ordinary life. Consider color. The wavelength of light reflecting off a ripe tomato is, in itself, just electromagnetic radiation, a physical property with no inherent redness contained within it. Redness is not a feature of the photon. Redness is what your visual system and your brain's interpretation of signals from your visual system generates in response to that wavelength. A creature with different visual biology, many insects, for instance, which perceive ultraviolet patterns on flowers that are completely invisible to us, would process that same tomato using an entirely different and equally valid structure of color experience. The tomato isn't secretly red in some absolute sense. Redness is something contributed by the observing mind. Consider sound in the same way. A tree falling in an empty forest generates vibrations moving through the air, compressions and rarefactions of molecules, entirely mechanical and physical. But sound, as an actual auditory experience, only exists at the point where a nervous system translates those vibrations into the subjective sensation of hearing. Without an ear and a brain to do that translation, there are only vibrating air molecules, no sound in the experiential sense at all. Consider object permanence, something almost every human being takes so completely for granted that it feels absurd to question. When you close a drawer and walk out of the room, you don't seriously entertain the possibility that the objects inside it cease to exist the moment you stop observing them. But notice that this assumption that unobserved objects continue existing in a stable, determinate way is exactly that, an assumption, one so deeply built into how human cognition operates that we experience it not as a belief we hold, but as an obvious fact about the world. Kant would say this is precisely the kind of thing the mind supplies rather than discovers. The confidence feels like direct perception. It's actually a cognitive structure operating so smoothly and automatically that its own operation becomes invisible to us. There's a further layer to Kant's argument worth including, because it addresses an objection that tends to arise naturally at this point. If space, time, and causation are contributed by the mind rather than discovered in the world, why do science and mathematics work so reliably? Why can physicists predict the trajectory of a comet with breathtaking precision, using equations grounded in exactly these categories Kant claims are mental constructions rather than external facts? Kant's answer is that the categories, while contributed by the mind rather than read off an independent world, are not arbitrary or personal. They are, he argued, universal and necessary features of any mind capable of coherent experience at all. Every human being organizes experience using the same basic structure of space-time and causal connection, which is precisely why we can build a shared science, communicate about a shared world, and achieve such astonishing predictive success. The reliability of science, for Kant, isn't evidence that we're directly perceiving reality as it is in itself. It's evidence that human cognitive architecture is remarkably consistent, and that consistency generates a stable, shared, rule-governed phenomenal world, even if that world remains, at bottom, one particular species' way of organizing a deeper reality none of us can access directly. This is Kant's central, difficult point, restated as plainly as possible. We never experience reality itself. We only ever experience reality as it has already been filtered, organized, and structured by the perceiving mind using categories the mind brings to the encounter rather than categories the mind simply reads off an independent world. The world as it is in itself, the noumenon, might be radically different from the world as it appears to us, and we have no way of stepping outside our own cognitive apparatus to check. It's worth being clear about what Kant is not saying, because his position is frequently confused with a much cruder kind of relativism. Kant is not saying that reality is whatever you want it to be, or that objective truth doesn't exist, or that all experience is equally arbitrary. Quite the opposite. He thought the structures of space, time, and causation are universal across all human minds, which is precisely why science works, why mathematics is reliable, and why we can communicate meaningfully about a shared phenomenal world. His claim is narrower and, in some ways, stranger, that this shared, reliable, structured world we all inhabit together is still, at bottom, a construction, an incredibly consistent one, but a construction nonetheless built by minds equipped with a particular cognitive architecture, rather than a direct, unmediated window onto the thing in itself. For over 2 centuries, Kant's argument remained primarily a matter of philosophical reasoning, rigorous, influential, but difficult to test in any empirical sense. Then neuroscience caught up, and what researchers began discovering about how the brain actually constructs experience turned out to bear an unsettling resemblance to what a Prussian philosopher had argued from his armchair centuries before anyone could scan a living brain at all. Modern neuroscience did not set out to prove Kant right. It arrived at something remarkably similar to his conclusion by a completely different route, not through pure reason but through decades of laboratory experiments, brain imaging, and an accumulating pile of strange perceptual anomalies that all seemed to point toward the same underlying principle. The brain isn't a camera. It isn't a passive recording device, faithfully capturing an external world and presenting it to a little observer sitting somewhere inside your skull. Instead, the brain appears to operate as a prediction engine, constantly generating a best guess about what's out there, and adjusting that guess only when incoming sensory data contradicts it strongly enough to force a correction. This model, often called predictive processing, has become one of the most influential frameworks in contemporary neuroscience and philosophy of mind. The core idea inverts the intuitive common sense picture most people carry around about perception. The common sense picture goes: light enters the eye, sound enters the ear, signals travel to the brain, and the brain assembles those signals into a picture of the world, the way you might assemble a photograph from raw pixels. Predictive processing suggests something closer to the opposite. The brain begins with a model, a prediction of what it expects to encounter based on prior experience, context, and learned patterns. Sensory input doesn't build the picture from scratch. It arrives as a kind of correction signal, nudging an already existing prediction toward greater accuracy when the prediction turns out to be wrong. It helps to have a visual example in mind before moving into the neuroscience, and a simple one will do. Close one eye right now, hold your other hand out in front of you at arm's length, and stare fixedly at a point slightly to one side of your thumb without letting your gaze drift. If you slowly move your thumb further out to the side while continuing to stare at that fixed point, at a certain distance your thumb will seem to vanish entirely, not go blurry, not fade gradually, but disappear completely, only to reappear once it moves further still. That's your blind spot, made briefly visible through a deliberate trick. For the entire rest of your life, your brain quietly papers over that gap so completely that you never notice it's there at all, using nothing more than assumption and pattern completion to manufacture visual content your eye never actually captured. Consider how staggeringly little raw information your eyes actually receive at any given moment, compared to the rich, detailed, stable world you seem to be experiencing. Your retina has a blind spot, an area with no photoreceptors at all, located where the optic nerve passes through the back of the eye. You should, logically, experience a hole in your visual field at that location. You don't. Your brain doesn't leave a gap. It fills it in seamlessly, using surrounding visual information and pattern prediction so convincingly that most people go their entire lives without ever noticing the blind spot exists unless a specific test is used to reveal it. That gap in your visual field isn't being detected and worked around. It's being invented, filled with plausible, predicted content that you experience as directly perceived. Or consider what happens with your peripheral vision more broadly. Only the very center of your visual field, the small area corresponding to the fovea at the back of your eye, actually captures sharp, detailed, high-resolution information. The rest of what you see in your peripheral vision is far low resolution, essentially a blurry, low-detail stream of light and motion. And yet your subjective experience is of a crisp, detailed, richly textured visual world extending smoothly from the center of your gaze all the way to the edges. That seamlessness is manufactured. Your brain is generating a detailed prediction of what's probably out there in your periphery, based on what it detected there a fraction of a second ago and what usually occupies that kind of space, and it's presenting that prediction to your conscious awareness as though it were directly observed, high-resolution fact. Color perception offers another striking example, one that connects directly back to Kant's point about redness not being a property of the photon. Color constancy is the well-documented phenomenon where an object appears to maintain a stable, consistent color across wildly different lighting conditions. A white shirt looks white in warm indoor lighting and in cool daylight, even though the actual wavelengths of light bouncing off that shirt and reaching your eye are measurably, significantly different in each case. Your visual system isn't simply reporting the raw wavelength data. It's actively correcting for the presumed lighting conditions, adjusting the perceived color to match what it predicts the true surface color probably is based on context. This is why certain optical illusions, the famous dress that some viewers perceived as blue and black and others as white and gold, is a well-known modern example, can produce such dramatically different subjective experiences from the exact same raw visual input. Different brains, making different assumptions about the ambient lighting, generate different color predictions from identical data. Change blindness offers a particularly unsettling demonstration of how much the brain fills in rather than faithfully records. In classic experiments, researchers show participants two nearly identical images or two versions of a video, with one substantial difference between them: an object disappearing, a person's clothing changing color, an entire building vanishing from the background. When the change happens gradually or during a brief visual interruption like a blink or a camera cut, a striking number of viewers fail to notice the change at all, even when they're specifically told to watch for one. This isn't a failure of eyesight. The visual information is fully present, fully available to the retina. It's a failure, or rather, a revealing feature of how the brain constructs a stable, continuous model of a scene and then simply trusts that model rather than re-verifying every detail moment to moment. Once your brain has settled on this is a picture of a street with a red car, it tends to keep running with that prediction rather than exhaustively rescanning every pixel for changes. The rubber hand illusion pushes this same principle into the domain of bodily experience, and it tends to be even more viscerally disturbing to witness or experience firsthand. In the classic setup, a participant sits with one real hand hidden from view, while a realistic rubber hand is placed in front of them, positioned where their real hand would normally be. An experimenter then simultaneously strokes both the hidden real hand and the visible rubber hand with a small brush in perfect synchrony. After a short period of this synchronized stroking, most participants report something remarkable. They begin to feel as though the rubber hand is their own hand. Not metaphorically, they report an actual sensation of touch localized to the rubber hand, and if the experimenter suddenly threatens the rubber hand with a needle or a hammer, participants typically flinch, sometimes even showing measurable stress responses, as though their real hand were in danger. Your brain's sense of what counts as your body turns out to be far more negotiable, far more constructed from predicted sensory correlations than most people would ever intuitively guess. The felt boundary of the self is not a fixed, given fact. It's a running prediction, and that prediction can be hijacked with nothing more sophisticated than two paintbrushes and some careful timing. Hallucinations and phantom limbs push the same underlying logic to its most extreme and clinically significant conclusions. Patients who have lost a limb frequently continue to feel sensations, sometimes pain, sometimes itching, sometimes a sense of movement located in a limb that no longer physically exists. This isn't a simple misfiring at the site of the amputation. It reflects the brain's ongoing internal model of the body, a model that was built up over years of sensory experience and doesn't immediately update just because the physical limb is gone. The brain continues predicting sensory signals from a limb it still expects to be there, and those predictions are experienced subjectively as real physical sensations, sometimes agonizingly real. Similarly, hallucinations experienced during certain psychiatric conditions, extreme sensory deprivation, high fevers, or specific neurological disorders reveal what happens when the brain's predictive machinery becomes untethered from adequate correction by incoming sensory data. Under ordinary conditions, prediction and sensory correction are held in a tight, stable balance. When that balance breaks down, when prediction overwhelms correction, the result is a perceptual experience that feels every bit as vivid, as present, as undeniably real as anything you're experiencing right now, despite corresponding to nothing actually happening in the external environment. One more phenomenon is worth including here because it demonstrates the predictive brain at its most dramatic, dreaming itself. Every single night, without any external sensory input at all, eyes closed, ears mostly ignored, the body largely paralyzed to prevent you from acting out what's happening. Your brain generates a complete, fully immersive sensory world, landscapes, faces, physical sensations, entire conversations, sometimes entire emotional arcs that feel as significant as anything experienced while awake. If the brain is capable of constructing an entire convincing world from essentially nothing, purely from internal prediction with no sensory grounding whatsoever, then it becomes considerably harder to treat your waking perceptual experience as some fundamentally different category of thing, a direct window onto external reality, categorically distinct from the entirely self-generated content of a dream. The difference between waking and dreaming may be one of degree in how tightly prediction is held in check by incoming sensory correction, rather than one of fundamental kind. Taken together, this growing body of neuroscience arrives at a conclusion that would have felt to Kant like vindication delivered 2 centuries late from an entirely unexpected direction. The brain isn't recording reality passively and faithfully, the way a camera records a scene. It's generating a best guess continuously, automatically, invisibly, and only correcting that guess when the mismatch between prediction and incoming sensory data becomes large enough to demand it. Most of the time, most of what you experience as directly seeing or directly hearing the world is actually a remarkably sophisticated prediction dressed up by your own mind to feel like a mediated, immediate contact with reality. This raises a question worth sitting with honestly, rather than rushing past. If your ordinary, everyday perception is already this heavily constructed, filling in blind spots, smoothing over low-resolution peripheral data, correcting colors based on assumed lighting, occasionally relocating your sense of embodiment onto a rubber hand, how confident, really, should you be in the reliability of perception as a guide to what's actually, fundamentally out there? Kant argued this from pure reason. Neuroscience has spent the last several decades arriving at strikingly similar territory through careful experimentation. But if everything you experience depends this heavily on internal construction, internal prediction, and internal observation, a stranger question starts to surface, one that leads out of philosophy and neuroscience entirely, and into the strangest, most empirically verified, and most genuinely paradoxical territory in all of modern science. Because it turns out that observation itself, on the smallest possible scale, may not be a passive act at all. And when physicists went looking for the fundamental, bedrock layer of physical reality, the level beneath atoms, beneath the neurons doing all this predicting, they found something that seems to depend, in some deeply strange way, on whether or not anyone or anything is looking. Does reality exist before it's observed? For most of human history, that question would have sounded almost meaningless, a kind of philosopher's wordplay with no real bearing on physics. Of course reality exists before it's observed. The moon doesn't wink out of existence when nobody's looking at it. That's simply common sense, and for centuries, common sense and physics were comfortably aligned. Then, in the early 20th century, physicists began probing matter at the smallest possible scales, and common sense quietly stopped applying. The story usually begins with a deceptively simple experiment first performed in its modern form in the early 1900s and refined many times since, the double-slit experiment. Picture a barrier with 2 narrow, parallel slits cut into it, and behind that barrier a detection screen that records wherever particles land. If you fire a stream of small physical objects, marbles, say through the 2 slits, you'd expect them to build up 2 distinct clusters on the screen behind, roughly aligned with the 2 openings. That's exactly what happens with marbles. It's exactly what common sense predicts. But when physicists fired individual electrons or photons, particles of light, through the same 2-slit setup, something happened that common sense simply cannot accommodate. Instead of two clusters, the particles built up an interference pattern on the screen, a series of alternating bright and dark bands, the same kind of pattern you'd get if you sent overlapping ripples of water through two gaps and watched the waves interfere with each other, reinforcing in some places and cancelling out in others. Somehow, individual particles, fired one at a time, were behaving like waves, interfering with themselves as though each single electron were somehow passing through both slits simultaneously and interfering with its own alternate path. This alone would have been strange enough to overturn centuries of classical physics. But the experiment gets stranger still. Physicists wanted to know which slit each electron was actually passing through, so they set up detectors at the slits themselves, designed to observe and record which specific slit each individual particle traveled through on its way to the screen. The moment they did this, the moment they introduced any measurement designed to reveal which path each particle took, the interference pattern vanished. The particles stopped behaving like overlapping waves and started behaving exactly like the marbles, building up two simple clusters, corresponding directly to the two slits, with no interference at all. Simply by observing which path the particle took, the experimenters changed the fundamental behavior of the particle itself. Without that observation, the particle behaved as though it existed in some strange, unresolved condition, not definitely at slit 1, not definitely at slit 2, but in something physicists call a superposition, a kind of simultaneous, unresolved coexistence of possibilities. The moment an observation forced the particle to reveal a definite path, that superposition collapsed into one specific, classical outcome. This is not a metaphor, and it isn't a matter of measurement simply being clumsy or disruptive in some ordinary mechanical sense, like how sticking a thermometer into a small cup of hot water slightly cools the water by contact. This had been tested, refined, and confirmed across nearly a century of increasingly sophisticated experiments using increasingly subtle and indirect ways of extracting which path information and the pattern holds. Whenever which path information becomes available, even in principle, even without a conscious being directly looking at a screen, the interference pattern collapses. Whenever that information remains genuinely unavailable, the interference pattern persists. Reality, at this scale, appears to behave differently depending on whether certain kinds of information about it exist anywhere in the universe. A variation on the double-slit experiment, known as the delayed choice quantum eraser, pushes the strangeness even further, and it's worth including because it seems, at first glance, to threaten something even stranger than ordinary collapse, a kind of retroactive influence on the past. In these experiments, physicists arrange the setup so that the decision about whether to record which path information happens after the particle has already passed through the slits and technically already been detected, its data logged and stored. And yet, when researchers later choose to erase the which path information rather than examine it, the correlated data analyzed retroactively still shows an interference pattern, as though the earlier choice to preserve or discard the path information reached backward to affect an event that had, in some sense, already happened. It's important to be careful here, because this result does not actually allow sending information backward through time in any way that could violate causality, and most physicists resist the more sensational retrocausal framing popular science writing sometimes applies to it. The full explanation involves the correlations between entangled particle pairs, analyzed together after the fact, rather than a signal traveling backward on its own. But even in its careful, technically precise form, the experiment underscores just how far quantum behavior departs from the simple, linear, common-sense picture of cause coming before effect never influencing cause, that governs literally every other domain of ordinary human experience. Physicists refer to this broader puzzle as the measurement problem, and it sits at the very center of quantum mechanics, unresolved in any way that commands universal agreement even after a century of the most successful, most precisely verified physical theory ever developed. Before measurement, a quantum system is described by something called a wave function, a mathematical object that doesn't describe a single definite state, but rather a distribution of probabilities across multiple possible states simultaneously. An electron's wave function might describe a range of possible positions, a range of possible momenta, a range of possible spins, all coexisting mathematically until a measurement forces the system into one specific definite outcome. Physicists call this the collapse of the wave function, and it remains one of the strangest, least intuitive features of the best-tested physical theory human beings have ever produced. Several major interpretations have emerged over the decades, each attempting to make sense of what's actually happening during this collapse, and they disagree with each other in ways that are still actively debated by working physicists today. Before turning to those interpretations, it's worth pausing on just how far this strangeness extends beyond a single tabletop experiment, because a skeptic could reasonably wonder whether the double-slit result is some kind of isolated curiosity rather than a genuine feature of physical law. It isn't isolated. A related phenomenon called quantum entanglement demonstrates something equally strange and arguably even harder to intuitively accept. Two particles prepared together under the right conditions can become entangled in such a way that measuring a property of one particle instantaneously determines the corresponding property of the other, even if that other particle is now light years away, with no signal, no transmission, no physical connection bridging the distance in any conventional sense. Einstein famously distrusted this implication of quantum theory so deeply that he dismissed it as spooky action at a distance, and spent years trying to construct arguments showing that quantum mechanics had to be an incomplete description of some deeper, fully deterministic reality lying underneath it. Decades after his death, increasingly precise experiments closing loophole after loophole that skeptics proposed to explain the results away through some more conventional mechanism have confirmed entanglement to remarkable statistical precision. Whatever is happening at this scale, it does not resemble the behavior of small, independent billiard balls obeying local, common-sense causation. It resembles something considerably stranger, for which classical physics and classical intuition were never built to account. The oldest and historically most influential is the Copenhagen interpretation, developed primarily by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg in the 1920s. Roughly speaking, it holds that the wave function is a genuinely complete description of a quantum system before measurement, not a description of our ignorance about some hidden, already determined reality, but a description of an actual, objectively unresolved condition. Measurement, under this view, causes a real, physical collapse of that unresolved condition into one definite outcome, and it treats this collapse as a fundamental, irreducible feature of nature, not something requiring further explanation. Critics have long found this deeply unsatisfying, precisely because it draws a somewhat mysterious line between the quantum world of superpositions and the classical, definite world we actually experience, without ever fully explaining what physically constitutes a measurement or why crossing that line causes collapse. An alternative, and increasingly popular, interpretation avoids the collapse problem entirely by denying that collapse happens at all. The many worlds interpretation, first proposed by Hugh Everett in 1957, argues that the wave function never actually collapses. Instead, every possible outcome of a quantum measurement actually occurs, each one branching off into its own separate, equally real universe. Under this view, when an electron's wave function describes multiple possible positions and a measurement is made, reality doesn't collapse into just one of those positions. The universe itself splits, with one branch containing an observer who measured the electron in position A and a separate, equally real branch containing an observer who measured it in position B. Under many worlds, you are constantly, continuously branching into an almost incomprehensibly vast number of parallel versions of yourself, each one experiencing a different outcome of every quantum event that has ever occurred, with no communication possible between the branches. It's an interpretation that resolves the measurement problem by refusing to privilege any single outcome as the real one at the cost of accepting an ontology of unimaginable, empirically unverifiable proliferation. There are other serious interpretations to pilot wave theory, which restores a kind of hidden, always definite reality guided by an underlying wave objective collapse theories, which propose that wave functions collapse spontaneously and physically after enough time or complexity, independent of any observer at all. Physicists have not reached consensus on which, if any, of these interpretations correctly describes what's actually happening beneath the mathematics. What they largely agree on, however, is the mathematics itself. The predictions of quantum theory have been tested to extraordinary precision across an enormous range of experiments, and the theory has never once failed a rigorous empirical test. The disagreement isn't about whether quantum mechanics works. It works spectacularly well. The disagreement is about what quantum mechanics is telling us about the underlying nature of reality. Now here's where a great deal of popular science communication goes seriously wrong, and it's worth being careful and precise about it because the temptation to overstate this argument is enormous, and giving in to that temptation actually cheapens what is already a genuinely mind-bending set of facts. You will frequently encounter the claim that quantum mechanics proves that consciousness creates reality, that human observation, specifically, is what causes the wave function to collapse, implying some deep, almost mystical link between the human mind and the fabric of physical existence. This claim massively overstates what physicists have actually established, and most working physicists regard it as a misunderstanding, often traced back to loose popularized language used in early explanations of the double-slit experiment and the broader measurement problem. What the experiments actually show is that the interference pattern depends on whether which path information becomes available anywhere in the physical system, not specifically on whether a conscious mind becomes aware of that information. In many experimental setups, the measurement that destroys the interference pattern is performed by inanimate detection equipment with no human being anywhere near the results, and often no human being ever actually looking at the recorded data until long after the experiment concludes. The collapse or the apparent collapse, depending on which interpretation you favor, happens in relation to physical interaction and the availability of information within the physical system, not specifically in relation to human consciousness observing that information. Consciousness isn't a special, uniquely privileged ingredient in the equation. The word observer in quantum mechanics is closer to a technical term meaning any physical interaction that records which path or which state information, not a mind that is aware and looking. So the honest, careful version of this claim is considerably stranger and considerably more interesting than the mystical shortcut. Quantum mechanics shows that the nature of observation, meaning physical interaction and the availability of information within a system, is deeply and genuinely mysterious in ways that remain unresolved by any current interpretation commanding full scientific consensus. But the science does not require, or even particularly support, the claim that consciousness specifically is the mechanism responsible for collapsing the wave function. That's an extrapolation, usually made by people outside physics, stretching a genuinely strange and well-verified phenomenon into a much larger metaphysical claim that the physics itself doesn't actually license. What remains once you strip away the mystical overreach is still remarkable enough on its own. At the most fundamental scale, physicists have been able to probe physical systems appear to exist in genuinely unresolved, probabilistic states not simply unknown to us, the way an unflipped coin under a cup is unknown but already secretly determined, but actually mathematically undetermined until some kind of physical interaction forces a resolution into one definite outcome. Whether that resolution constitutes an actual, objective collapse, or a branching into parallel realities, or something else entirely that current interpretations haven't yet correctly described, remains one of the deepest open questions in all of physics. It's worth pausing to on the sheer scale of confirmation behind quantum theory, because it can be tempting to file all of this away as speculative or fringe, when the opposite is true. Quantum mechanics underlies the transistor, and therefore every computer, phone, and screen you have ever used. It underlies magnetic resonance imaging, laser technology, and the precise atomic clocks that make GPS navigation possible. The strange, counterintuitive behavior described in these experiments isn't a marginal curiosity confined to obscure laboratories, it's the operating foundation of enormous swaths of modern technology verified to a level of precision that few other scientific theories in history have ever matched. That combination is what makes quantum mechanics so genuinely disorienting to sit with honestly. It is simultaneously among the most rigorously confirmed theories human beings have ever produced and among the most philosophically unresolved, with brilliant, careful people still disagreeing a century later about what its equations are actually telling us reality is doing when nobody is looking. There's a thought experiment within quantum foundations proposed by the physicist Eugene Wigner that captures the strangeness of all this more vividly than almost any other, and it's worth including before we move to close things out. Imagine a physicist, call her Wigner's friend, sealed inside a laboratory, performing a quantum measurement on some particle, observing, say, whether a photon's spin comes out up or down. From her perspective, the measurement happens, the wave function collapses, and she records a single, definite outcome. Simple enough. But now imagine Wigner himself, standing outside the sealed laboratory, unable to see what's happening inside. According to the mathematics of quantum theory, until Wigner opens the door and looks, the entire laboratory, including his friend, her equipment, and her now recorded result, can be described as existing in a superposition of both possible outcomes simultaneously, a state in which his friend has measured up and a state in which she has measured down, both mathematically present at once from Wigner's external vantage point. But this seems absurd from his friend's perspective, since she is quite certain she experienced one definite outcome, not some superposition of two. So which is it? Did her measurement produce one definite reality, or does reality remain undetermined until Wigner, standing outside, also observes it? Different interpretations answer this differently, and there's no consensus. But the thought experiment makes vivid something all these interpretations struggle with, that observation and measurement, concepts that feel intuitively simple in ordinary life, turn out to resist any fully consistent, universally agreed upon definition once you take quantum mechanics completely seriously. After 2,000 years, then, the questions in this tradition have moved from shadows flickering on a cave wall, to whether an evil demon might be deceiving a man by a fire, to a brain suspended in nutrient fluid, to statistical arguments about ancestor simulations run by advanced civilizations, to the built-in architecture of human cognition itself, to whether particles have definite properties at all before something interacts with them. Each argument approaches the same underlying suspicion from a different angle, using different tools built by people separated by centuries and continents and entirely different vocabularies for describing what they'd found. And yet they all arrive from wildly different directions at some version of the same unsettling conclusion, that the confident, solid, unquestioned reality most of us walk around assuming is far less secure, far less obviously guaranteed than it feels. So where does this leave us? 7 arguments, 7 centuries and traditions, one central, unresolved question: what is reality? It's worth walking back through them one more time, not to summarize what's already been said, but to notice something that only becomes visible once you see the whole sequence laid out together, a pattern connecting arguments that were never designed to speak to one another. Plato began by locating the deception in the senses and in the physical world itself. For him, the objects around us, chairs, trees, bodies, cities, were never the deepest layer of reality to begin with. They were shadows cast by a more perfect and changing realm of forms, glimpsed only imperfectly through the distorting medium of matter and sensed experience. The prisoners in the cave weren't being lied to by some external trickster. They were simply limited by their position, mistaking the only reality available to them for the whole of what exists. Descartes shifted the deception inward, but kept it external to the self. He didn't need Plato's metaphysics of forms to generate radical doubt. He needed only a fire, a piece of paper, and the observation that dreams can feel exactly as real as waking life while you're inside them. Where Plato blamed the senses for showing us shadows of something more real, Descartes questioned whether the senses could even reliably confirm that anything external exists at all. His evil demon is Plato's puppeteers, updated and intensified, no longer merely casting misleading shadows, but actively fabricating an entire deceptive world. Putnam and Bostrom took Descartes' demon and gave it a body first, biological, a brain suspended in a vat of nutrient fluid, wired to a machine generating a complete simulated existence, then computational, a hypothetical civilization with enough processing power to simulate not one deceived mind but potentially billions of them, running as ancestor simulations for reasons we can only speculate about. What changed across these updates wasn't the core structure of the doubt. Descartes had already established the fundamental shape of the problem centuries earlier. What changed was plausibility. A demon required belief in the supernatural. A vat requires only a scalpel, some electrodes, and technology we can already imagine extending. A simulation requires only more computing power than we currently possess, running on principles we already understand and use every day. Each version made the same ancient doubt harder to dismiss as a mere philosopher's game, because each version borrowed its plausibility from science and technology we already trust in every other context. Kant then did something genuinely different from everything before him. He didn't ask whether some external force might be deceiving us. He asked whether deception is even the right word for what's happening, because deception implies there's some accurate and distorted version of experience being denied to us by an outside trick. Kant's argument suggests something stranger, that there is no experience available to any mind ever that isn't already structured by that mind's own cognitive architecture. Space-time, causation, these aren't distortions layered on top of an otherwise accessible raw reality. They are the necessary conditions for having any experience of anything at all. There's no demon required, because the very equipment we use to perceive is itself doing the shaping. And then modern neuroscience arrived at Kant's conclusion from a completely different angle, not through pure reason, but through decades of careful experimentation, revealing that the brain isn't a camera passively recording an external world, but a prediction engine, constantly generating a best guess and updating it only when forced to by sufficiently strong contradicting evidence. The blind spots you never notice. The peripheral vision that's far blurrier than it feels. The color that shifts based on assumed lighting rather than raw wavelength. The rubber hand that starts to feel like your own. All of it points toward the same underlying architecture Kant described from his study in Königsberg 2 centuries before anyone could scan a living human brain. And finally, quantum mechanics pushed the question down to the smallest possible physical scale and found something that none of the earlier arguments had quite anticipated, that the raw material of physical reality itself, the electrons and photons beneath the chairs, the trees, the bodies, the neurons doing all this predicting, may not possess fully definite properties until some kind of physical interaction forces a resolution. Not because a demon is hiding the truth. Not because our cognitive architecture is filtering it, but because, as best as an entire century of rigorous, repeatedly verified experimentation can tell us, matter itself might genuinely exist in unresolved, probabilistic states until something forces it to resolve into one outcome. Notice what none of these 7 arguments actually accomplish, because it's just as important as what they do accomplish. None of them prove that reality is fake or illusory or simulated or non-existent. Plato never claimed the physical world doesn't exist, only that it's a lesser reflection of something more fundamental. Descartes never concluded that the external world definitely doesn't exist. He simply showed that we can't prove it does using reason alone, and then spent the rest of his work trying, however imperfectly, to rebuild a bridge back out to it. Putnam's argument, if anything, was partly designed to show that the brain in a vat hypothesis might be self-undermining rather than confirmed. Bostrom explicitly frames his argument as a probability distributed across three possibilities, only one of which involves us actually being simulated. Kant believed firmly in a stable, shared, reliably structured phenomenal world. He just located its stability in the mind rather than in some external, mind-independent reality. Predictive processing explains how ordinary perception works. It doesn't claim that ordinary perception is worthless or arbitrary. And quantum mechanics, properly understood without the mystical overreach that so often gets attached to it, describes precisely predictable statistical behavior at small scales. It doesn't claim that nothing is real, only that real at that scale doesn't behave the way intuition, built from a lifetime of encountering marbles and baseballs and other large, classical objects, would lead you to expect. So if none of these arguments prove reality is fake, what exactly have we actually established after 2,000 years and 7 completely different lines of reasoning converging from completely different directions? Something arguably more profound than a simple yes or no answer to is reality real? We've established that certainty, total, unassailable, foundation-level certainty about the fundamental nature of reality, may be permanently beyond human reach. Not because we haven't yet found the right experiment or the right argument or the right piece of evidence, but because every tool available for investigating reality is itself embedded inside the very system being investigated. Your senses can't verify your senses without circularity. Your reason can't step outside your reason to check whether reason itself is reliable. Your consciousness can't observe itself from some neutral, external vantage point untouched by the very consciousness doing the observing. We are, all of us, permanently positioned on the inside of the thing we're trying to evaluate from the outside. There is no Archimedean point, no external platform, entirely free from the system itself, from which to take a clean, unbiased measurement of the whole. This isn't a reason for despair, though it can feel that way the first time you sit with it honestly. It's closer to an invitation toward a particular kind of intellectual humility, one that most people, most of the time, don't have much practice sitting with because ordinary life simply doesn't require it. You don't need to resolve the brain in a vat hypothesis to cross a street safely, or love the people in your life, or find meaning in your work, or feel the sun on your skin. The practical business of living doesn't actually depend on winning this 2,000-year-old argument. But the argument still matters because it reveals something true and important about the limits of human knowledge, about the humility that's appropriate whenever we're tempted to speak with total, unquestioned confidence about the fundamental nature of anything. There's also something worth noticing about why these 7 arguments, despite emerging from entirely different eras, entirely different disciplines, and entirely different starting assumptions, keep landing on strikingly similar underlying structures. Plato didn't know about quantum mechanics. Kant never heard of predictive processing. Descartes had no concept of a computer, let alone a simulated ancestor civilization. And yet each of them, working with the tools and vocabulary available in their own moment, independently arrive at some version of the same fundamental insight, that there is a meaningful, perhaps unbridgeable gap between reality as it is and reality as it appears to a limited, embedded observer trying to make sense of it from the inside. That kind of convergence across cultures, centuries, and completely different methodologies, from pure philosophical reasoning to controlled laboratory experimentation to rigorous mathematical physics, suggests we're not simply dealing with an idle philosopher's game, invented once and endlessly recycled. We're dealing with something that keeps reasserting itself in whatever vocabulary a given era happens to have available, because it touches something genuinely and stubbornly true about the situation of any finite embedded mind trying to understand the totality it's embedded within. It's also worth asking, honestly, whether any of this should change how you actually live, because it's easy to let a night of philosophy stay comfortably abstract, entertaining but inert, filed away as an interesting curiosity rather than something that touches your actual days. I don't think the honest answer is that you should walk away doubting the reality of your coffee cup tomorrow morning, or hesitating before crossing a street because Descartes' demon might be waiting on the other side. That would be a kind of category error, treating a philosophical argument about the limits of certainty as though it were practical advice about how to navigate an ordinary Tuesday. The prisoners in the cave still had to eat, still had to cooperate with each other, still had to build something resembling a functioning life, shadows or no shadows. Certainty about ultimate metaphysical foundations was never a prerequisite for living well, and none of these 7 philosophers, whatever their doubts, seem to have concluded otherwise. Descartes still got up in the morning, wrote his letters, tended his garden. Kant still took his famously punctual afternoon walk, rain or shine, for decades, undisturbed by the fact that his own metaphysics denied him direct access to the nominal world outside his window. What these arguments are good for, I think, is something quieter and more durable than a change in daily behavior. They're good for loosening the grip of an uncertainty, the kind of certainty people reach for most aggressively in exactly the domains where it's least warranted. Every dogmatic conviction, every close-minded refusal to entertain that you might be wrong, every argument that ends with, well, that's just obviously how reality works, borrows, whether the person making it realizes it or not, from the same unexamined confidence the prisoners in the cave had about their shadows. 2,500 years of careful, rigorous, technically sophisticated argument, converging from wildly different directions, all point toward the same modest conclusion. Total certainty about the fundamental nature of reality is a much heavier claim than it feels like in the moment you're making it. Carrying that awareness lightly, not as paralyzing doubt but as ordinary intellectual humility, might be the single most practical thing any of these 7 arguments actually has to offer. I want to end with something reflective rather than conclusive, because I think a conclusive ending would actually betray everything we've just spent this time building together. Perhaps reality is exactly what it appears to be: solid, external, independent, exactly as trustworthy as your senses and your common sense have always assumed. Most working scientists, most philosophers, and certainly most people going about their daily lives operate, quite reasonably, as though this is simply true, and there are good practical and even philosophical reasons for the default confidence. Or perhaps everything you have ever experienced have been filtered through cognitive structures you didn't choose and can't step outside of, reconstructed by a predictive brain that fills in far more than it directly records, statistically more likely to be simulated than original if certain assumptions about advanced computing civilizations turn out to hold, and built at the smallest observable scale, from a physical substrate that may not even possess fully definite properties until something forces it to resolve. The remarkable thing, genuinely remarkable, when you sit with it, is that each of these possibilities has been defended seriously and rigorously by some of the most careful thinkers our species has produced. Not cranks, not mystics peddling comforting nonsense. Trained philosophers, working physicists, careful experimental neuroscientists, publishing in peer-reviewed venues, building on centuries of accumulated argument and evidence. The persistence of this uncertainty across every method humanity has developed for pursuing truth tells you something important about the actual shape of the problem, rather than about any particular failure of effort or intelligence. We may never stand outside our own minds long enough to compare our experience directly against reality itself, side by side, checking one against the other the way you might check a copy against an original document. That comparison would require a vantage point outside all possible experience, a place to stand that, by definition, no experiencing being could ever actually occupy. So perhaps the deepest question this entire tradition has been circling for 2,500 years was never really what is reality. Perhaps it's something quieter and in its own way more honest. What would it even mean to know for certain that you'd found it, and can any mind, embedded as it necessarily is inside the very reality it's trying to evaluate, ever really occupy the position such certainty would require? That question doesn't come with an answer waiting at the end of it. It comes with something else instead, a kind of attention. The next time you look at a chair, or hear a voice, or feel entirely certain about something you've never actually examined closely, it might be worth pausing just for a moment and remembering the prisoners in the cave watching their shadows, certain, perfectly, comfortably certain that they were watching the whole of the world.